Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was 33 years old. She had never asked to be famous. She had spent her entire career standing precisely behind the frame, controlling what the world heard, engineering the silence around other people's brilliance with a precision that her industry recognized as extraordinary. Then she married John F. Kennedy Jr., and the frame turned without warning, and everything she had built her professional life upon, privacy, control, the strategic quiet, was consumed by the loudest, most grief-saturated name in American political history. 3 years later, on a July night over dark Atlantic water, the sound of her world stopped entirely. Not gradually. Not with warning. The radar track shows it with a cold, mechanical clarity that no amount of subsequent documentation has made easier to absorb. One moment the aircraft is there, and then, in the space of a single radar sweep, it is not. What followed was 5 days of ocean searching, a nation suspended between knowing and not knowing, and a silence over those Massachusetts waters that the archive has preserved in full and devastating detail, but that no archive has ever adequately explained. She controlled what you heard. That was, for nearly a decade inside the Manhattan fashion world of the 1990s, the precise and extraordinary nature of Carolyn Bessette's professional authority, not what you saw, though she understood visual strategy with equal acuity, but what reached you, what was spoken into the air, which press inquiry received a response, and which queries met a wall of deliberate, perfectly calibrated silence. As director of public relations at Calvin Klein, colleagues described in accounts preserved across multiple biographical sources a woman who could enter a floor of 40 people in full creative chaos, and the ambient noise level would adjust around her, not because she demanded it, but because her quality of stillness functioned as a kind of acoustic gravity, pulling the room's competing frequencies toward a lower, steadier register. In an industry that ran entirely on noise, the overlapping percussion of Fashion Week preparation, the competitive din of showroom opinion and editorial pressure, she was the rare human instrument that achieved authority through the deliberate withholding of sound. The silence she built was never accidental. Each decision about what not to say, which photographers received access and which were denied, how much air a story was given before she closed the valve. These were the daily instruments of a professional who understood that controlled absence is more powerful than managed presence, that what the public cannot hear it will inevitably amplify in its own imagination, and that the person who governs the quiet governs everything that floods in to fill it. John F. Kennedy Jr. occupied the diametrically opposite acoustic position, and had done so since before he could speak. He had never known a morning without the camera shutter. From the moment he was photographed as an infant on the White House lawn, the mechanical percussion of press attention had attended his life as a permanent and entirely involuntary companion, a soundtrack inherited rather than chosen, as inseparable from his daily existence as his father's name and his father's absence. Contemporaneous news footage from his adult years in Lower Manhattan documents this with uncomfortable specificity. He could not hail a cab without drawing a perimeter of lenses, without triggering the collective intake of breath that preceded a press gathering, without the particular low murmur that follows famous people through cities like weather they cannot outrun. Two worlds collided. The woman who governed silence and the man who had never known it moved, in the early 1990s, through overlapping professional circles in New York, and the documented sightings that began accumulating in the tabloid record through 1992 and beyond carried the predictable soundtrack of that media environment. The telephoto click from across a street, the radio chatter between competing outlets triangulating the same story. Carolyn's response was professionally instinctive. No interviews, no statements, no audio record offered to a machine designed specifically to extract one. The people who worked alongside her during this period recalled, in accounts preserved across multiple sources, that she managed the situation with the same techniques she had applied to other people's reputations for years, and that the gap between professional expertise and personal exposure never fully closed, but she held it longer than anyone watching from the outside might have predicted. The wedding, September 21, 1996, Cumberland Island, Georgia, was a masterwork of engineered silence. A remote island, fewer than 40 guests, a ceremony at the First African Baptist Church, conducted entirely beyond the reach of the press apparatus that had been preparing for what should have been the most covered social event of its decade. The media arrived to discover that the silence had already happened without them. The bells of the church, documented in contemporaneous accounts, rang across an island landscape from which every camera had been excluded, the last time, as the documented record makes devastatingly clear, that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy would stand at the center of a major event and hear anything other than the sound of public attention pressing against the perimeter she had built. The silence broke immediately. The woman who had lived and worked her entire professional life behind the curtain was now the subject, the object of daily, uncontrollable scrutiny, the person the cameras had been waiting for without knowing it, and the sounds that had previously surrounded only John now surrounded her as well, without her permission, without reference to her expertise, without any of the institutional authority that her position at Calvin Klein had granted her when she was the one deciding what the... I want to tell you something I did not anticipate when I began this research. I expected to find archive material about John. His life is extensively and almost exhaustingly documented, recordings and interviews and footage spanning the entirety of his public existence. What I did not expect was the near-total acoustic absence of Carolyn. There is almost no substantial audio record of her voice. A woman who spent a decade working in communications, who understood the relationship between sound and power more acutely than almost anyone in her professional world, who built her authority on the precise governance of what was heard and what was withheld. She left almost no audio behind for the people who would come later. I have sat with this fact in a very quiet room for longer than I can properly explain. I cannot tell you with certainty whether it is evidence of how completely she controlled her public self, or evidence of how completely that control was ultimately taken from her. I suspect it is both, and I suspect those are not as different as they first appear. Marriage did not quiet the world. What the documented record, assembled through long-form biographical sources, retrospective profiles, and reported accounts from those who knew her during the years 1996 through 1999, describes is a woman experiencing a specific and accelerating dislocation, the kind that has no professional remedy because its source is the professional identity itself having been dissolved by proximity to a name too large to live beside, without losing the... The press gathered on the sidewalk below their Tribeca loft on certain mornings, and the documented detail that arrests me every time I encounter it is this. Their presence was audible from the upper floors before it was visible. A low collective murmur, the shuffle of footwear, the occasional shout cutting above the street noise to reach whatever quiet existed behind those windows. She knew they were there before she could see them. She had spent her career on the other side of exactly that threshold. The people who knew her during this period are consistent across multiple documented accounts in ways that matter enormously for the historical record. They do not describe a cold woman or a difficult one, despite the tabloid shorthand that had begun to calcify around her name in print. They describe a woman of acute perceptive sensitivity, sensitive enough that the uncontrollable acoustic environment of her post-wedding life produced in her something beyond ordinary discomfort. She was funny, those accounts insist, genuinely and quickly funny, with a dry wit the cameras never reached. She was fiercely loyal to the friends, her new circumstances made increasingly difficult to see regularly. She read people before they had finished entering the room, a professional skill that had become, under sustained public scrutiny, something closer to a permanent and exhausting vigilance. John, meanwhile, was navigating pressures of his own that the documentary record captures in specific and significant detail. George Magazine, the political culture publication he had founded in 1995 and edited with genuine creative investment, was operating under documented and increasing financial strain through 1998 and into 1999. The ambient noise of that institutional anxiety, the editorial meetings held in hushed tones, the investor conversations, the uncertainty of a creative enterprise whose future remained unresolved, formed a sustained background frequency in his professional life during exactly the period when his personal life was also under the heaviest external pressure it had yet faced. He had obtained his private pilot's license in April 1998, and the sky had become, by multiple documented accounts, the place where neither the press nor the financial pressures of George nor the complicated acoustics of public marriage could reach him. Flying was the one environment he had found where the noise stopped. What he had not yet obtained was his instrument rating. This is not a bureaucratic distinction. It is the difference between knowing how to fly and knowing how to trust what your instruments tell you when your body is actively lying to you. And in conditions of darkness over open water with the horizon erased by haze, the human body lies with complete physiological conviction. The vestibular system generates sensory reports that contradict the instruments with total confidence, creating a perceptual conflict in which felt experience and measured reality diverge catastrophically, and the pilot without sufficient instrument training is physiologically disposed to trust the sensation over the gauge. The NTSB accident report documents this mechanism with clinical precision. What the clinical language cannot restore is the specific human reality of that conflict in the darkness over Martha's Vineyard Sound. The engine hums. July 16, 1999. A Friday evening in midsummer, the city releasing its working week into warm air and the particular ambient noise of New York preparing for a weekend. The documented plan was straightforward. Depart Essex County Airport in New Jersey, fly northeast to Martha's Vineyard, drop Carolyn Bessette, Carolyn's sister, a 34-year-old associate at Morgan Stanley, described by those who knew her as warm, grounded, and deeply close to Carolyn, at the island, then continue to Hyannisport for the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy. The aircraft was a Piper Saratoga Roman 2 HP, single engine. The three people aboard were John, Carolyn, and Lauren. Radar data from the subsequent NTSB investigation establishes departure at approximately 8:38 p.m. The initial flight segment was normal. The radar track, the only continuous objective record of what happened over those hours, a thin line of sequential position reports archived in federal investigation data, shows expected behavior as the aircraft moved north along the New Jersey coastline and then east across Long Island Sound. The documented meteorological analysis of that evening, examined exhaustively in the NTSB investigation, establishes that conditions over Martha's Vineyard Sound had deteriorated significantly as the aircraft approached the Massachusetts coast. Haze had reduced visibility over open water. Darkness had eliminated the horizon reference on which visual flight depends. The NTSB investigation would characterize the conditions using measured, technical language. The technical language does not carry what those conditions mean inside a cockpit at night, over water, with the world outside the windscreen reduced to an undifferentiated dark. At approximately 9:40 p.m., the radar track shows the aircraft entering a descent southwest of Martha's Vineyard. The NTSB accident report, document NYC 99, MA 178, the authoritative record of what the investigation established, documents that the rate of descent increased to an estimated 4,700 feet per minute in the aircraft's final recorded moments. The probable cause, as determined by the NTSB, was the pilot's failure to maintain control during a descent over water at night, in conditions consistent with spatial disorientation. The ocean floor, 116 feet below the surface, approximately 7.5 miles southwest of Gay Head, received the wreckage at a time no radar sweep recorded, in a silence the water simply absorbed and kept. The sounds of that cockpit in those final minutes belong to no archive. The NTSB report is 47 pages. I have read it more times than is professionally necessary. What I return to, every time, is not the technical analysis, though the technical analysis is meticulous and, in its specific restraint, devastating, but a single documented fact buried inside the aircraft description section. The Piper Saratoga was not required to carry a flight data recorder or a cockpit voice recorder. These instruments are mandated for commercial aviation. Private aircraft of this class are not required to carry them, which means the final minutes inside that cockpit, whatever was said or not said, whatever sounds the three people aboard may have made, are not preserved anywhere. The archive, at the precise moment you most need it to speak, goes silent by law. I find this unbearable, in a way that has not diminished with repeated reading. Not because I want access to those final moments out of prurience, but because Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, a woman who governed her entire professional life through the precise control of what was heard and what was not, left the world in the one moment the apparatus that had pursued her could not reach, and the one moment she might have wanted the record to exist is the one moment it does not. I have no resolution for that. I have stopped looking for one. The search began in the early hours of July 17. Coast Guard vessels and aircraft moved through Nantucket Sound on radio frequencies that the documented operational record preserves in formal, technical language. The clipped communications of professional emergency response working methodically through coordinates, weather conditions, visibility reports, search patterns. By Saturday morning, the press apparatus that had followed John Kennedy Jr. across 38 years of his life had reoriented its entire frequency toward those same coordinates, and the sound of that weekend across the country was the sound of television sets running without interruption while a nation held a particular kind of breath. The breath that precedes news you already understand is coming, but cannot yet confirm. The crowd that gathered on the Tribeca sidewalk below their apartment was, by contemporaneous news accounts, largely silent. A New York crowd, standing still in the particular quiet of people who have lost the words for what they are standing in front of. 5 days. On July 21, 1999, divers located the wreckage on the ocean floor. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was 33 years old. Lauren Bessette was 34. John F. Kennedy Jr. was 38. Here is what the coverage of July 1999 failed to do, and what the historical record now demands be corrected. It collapsed 3 individuals into one story, and that story was, by the inescapable gravitational logic of American cultural memory, the Kennedy story. The name absorbed the other names. The 40 years of accumulated national grief already attached to that family, the assassinations, the tragedies, the continuous public mourning that had become almost institutional, provided a narrative field so enormous that Carolyn and Lauren Bessette were drawn into its orbit and partially obscured by it. This was not malice. It was structure. The Kennedy narrative had its infrastructure already built. The Bessette narrative did not. And so the louder story consumed the quieter ones, as it always does, because that is what loud stories are designed to do. The woman the archive actually describes, assembled carefully from testimonies preserved across multiple biographical sources, retrospective accounts, and the anniversary journalism of the 25 years since her death, is considerably more dimensional than the tabloid construction permitted. She was funny, the people who knew her insist across account after account, with a dry and rapid wit that the cameras never reached, because she kept it deliberately behind the threshold where cameras waited. She was fiercely loyal, and the isolation of her public position had made sustaining that loyalty increasingly difficult and increasingly important to her simultaneously. She was, by every documented account, a person of extraordinary perceptive intelligence, someone who understood the emotional architecture of a room before she had crossed its threshold, who read people with the precision that a decade of professional high-stakes communications work had sharpened into something close to instinct. She was struggling, those same accounts confirm, with the sustained weight of a public life she had not fully chosen and could not fully exit. None of this registered as noise. All of it was signal. The apparatus surrounding her was not calibrated to receive it. The quiet tells everything. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's public silences, her withdrawn visibility, her carefully managed unavailability, the consistent absence of her voice from the media landscape that continuously generated content about her, were read by that landscape as coldness, as difficulty, as the affectation of a woman who did not understand what her position required. The people who actually knew her read them as the only available response of a profoundly private person to a situation of total and involuntary exposure. She had spent years creating silence around other people as a professional instrument of power. She was now creating it around herself as the only form of self-preservation available to her. The technique was identical. The acoustics were identical. The meaning was entirely different. And the distinction matters, historically, humanly, permanently, because it determines whether she enters the lasting record as a reluctant supporting character in someone else's tragedy, or whether she is granted the dimensional presence the documented evidence of her actual life demands. The clock ticks. The hands move forward without permission, and somewhere in the distance, a frequency shifts that none of the instruments in the room have been calibrated to detect. If you have carried a memory of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy through the years, since July 1999, if you remember the specific quality of that Saturday morning, when the television or the radio delivered news that the summer heat made feel even more wrong, then that memory belongs to the human record, in a way that no official document can replicate or replace. The radar track preserves the trajectory. The NTSB report preserves the technical analysis. The Coast Guard logs preserve the search. What none of those documents preserve is the specific and irreplaceable texture of grief as it was actually experienced by people who watched these events unfold in real time, who carried these three names through decades of their own lives afterward, who still carry them. If her story reached you, if Carolyn Bessette Kennedy meant something to you, or means something still, the space below this video exists precisely for that voice. Not the official voice. Yours. Because the archive that matters most is not the one kept in federal databases. It is the one kept in the people who remember, and it diminishes every time one of those voices goes unshared. We want to hear what you carry. Her memory deserves a record that complete. The Atlantic Ocean, off Martha's Vineyard, is indifferent to the passage of time. The documents are not. And Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, a woman who understood with absolute professional precision that silence is never empty, that it is always full of whatever the listener brings to it, and that the person who controls the quiet controls the meaning, left behind a silence so specific and so vast that 25 years of journalism has not come close to filling it. That was always going to be true of her. She knew exactly how silence worked,